He body arced through the sky like a stone. Except stones don't have arms that flail. Stones don't have mouths frozen in screams. Stones don't leak fluids as they tumble end over end 300 feet through autumn air before crashing through the roof of a merchant's house in the harbor district of Caffa. October 1346. A Genoese soldier named Marco stands watch on the eastern wall. He's 19 years old. He's been standing watch for 4 months, every day the same. Eat stale bread. Stand on the wall. Watch Mongols. Return to barracks. Sleep. Repeat. The siege is boring. The Mongols can't breach the walls. The city has supplies for years. Marco's biggest worry is dying of boredom before dying of old age. Then the sky starts raining corpses. The first one surprises him. He watches it launch, realizes what it is mid-flight, vomits over the parapet before it even lands. The second one lands in the street below with a wet crunch that will echo in his nightmares for the rest of his short life. By the third one, Marco is running, abandoning his post, fleeing down the stairs, screaming warnings that no one understands because the words don't make sense even to him. The Mongols are throwing bodies. Human bodies. Dead bodies covered in black swellings and oozing pus. The Mongols have weaponized death itself. Before we dive into the horror, and trust me, we're diving deep, comment where you're from. I need to know how far this story travels. Are you in Italy where these bodies landed? Central Asia where they launched from? Drop your location. Let's map the descendants of people who survived this. Because if you're here, someone in your ancestry survived the plague that started with these corpses. Someone lived when 200 million died. Comment your location. Honor your survivor ancestors. This was the first biological warfare attack in recorded history. Not the first use of disease as a weapon. Armies had been poisoning wells and throwing diseased animals into cities for millennia. But this was the first deliberate attempt to spread epidemic disease, the first time a commander looked at a pandemic decimating his own army and thought, let's share this with the enemy. Let's weaponize the apocalypse itself. The siege of Caffa had been underway since June 1346. Khan Janabeg of the Golden Horde commanded 20,000 Mongol warriors surrounding the Genoese fortress. Caffa was a trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, the western terminus of the Silk Road, possibly the richest city in the Black Sea region. The Genoese had built massive fortifications. 30-foot walls. 10 feet thick. Stone blocks each weighing tons. Gates that could withstand battering rams. Towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. The city was, by medieval standards, impregnable. Janabeg had the manpower and the siege engines. He had trebuchets that could throw 300-pound stones over those walls. He had experience from dozens of successful sieges. But Caffa had one advantage that nullified all Mongol superiority: the sea. Genoese ships resupplied the city daily. Grain from Egypt. Weapons from Italy. Reinforcements from across the Mediterranean. As long as those ships arrived, the siege was futile. The Mongols were burning resources, achieving nothing. Janabeg's reputation was dying slowly outside walls he couldn't breach. Then plague arrived. Not as a weapon. As a catastrophe. September 1346. A merchant caravan from Samarkand reached the Mongol camp. They were carrying silk and spices and Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. Within days, Mongol soldiers started dying. Not from combat. From disease that turned their lymph nodes into swollen black masses, that rotted their flesh while they still breathed, that killed them screaming within 3 days of first fever. The mortality rate exceeded 90%. No treatment worked. Physicians died alongside patients. Panic spread as fast as plague. Within 2 weeks, thousands of Mongol soldiers were dead. The siege was collapsing. Units were deserting. Supply lines were breaking down as merchants refused to approach a plague-infected army. Janabeg faced the end of his military career and possibly his life. Failed Khans rarely lived long. And then someone, history doesn't record who, had an idea that would echo through 7 centuries and kill 200 million people across 3 continents. If we're dying from plague, make them die from plague. If disease defeats armies, weaponize disease. Use the corpses of plague victims as ammunition. Load them into trebuchets. Launch them over the walls. Let Kappa share in the dying. Turn catastrophe into strategy. Transform biological disaster into biological warfare. Think about that decision for a moment. Think about being the commander who gives that order. You're watching your army disintegrate. Your soldiers are dying of something you don't understand, can't fight, can't stop. You have two options: retreat and lose everything, or do something unprecedented. Something that violates every cultural norm about treatment of the dead. Something that will make you infamous forever. Weaponize death itself. Make the enemy share your horror. Janabeg gave the order. Mongol engineers began collecting corpses. Bodies of soldiers who died that morning, still warm, buboes fresh and leaking. They stripped the corpses, no point wasting clothing and armor. They loaded them into trebuchets. They calculated trajectories for objects that didn't fly like stones, that tumbled irregularly, that sometimes came apart in midair. They adjusted for wind and distance and the weight of different corpses. And they fired. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Imagine being inside Kaffa. You've been besieged for 4 months, but you're confident. The walls are holding. The Mongols are dying from disease you can smell on the wind when the breeze blows from their camp. You're winning. And then bodies start flying over the walls. Human corpses, bloated with decomposition, trailing fluids, crashing into your streets and buildings and water supplies. The message is clear and terrifying. There is no safety. There are no rules. The Mongols will make you share in the horror they're experiencing. Surrender or die. There is no third option. The Genoese tried to respond. They organized disposal teams. Men with cloth wrapped around their faces, gloves made from thick leather, long poles to avoid touching corpses directly. They worked in shifts hauling bodies to the harbor, throwing them into the Black Sea. They burned bodies in mass pyres that produced smoke visible for miles. They buried bodies in pits dug outside the city walls. They worked continuously, desperately, trying to remove the biological hazard before plague could spread. They were too late. Within 2 weeks, the first Genoese citizens developed fever. Within 3 weeks, dozens were dead. Within a month, plague was epidemic inside Kaffa. The disease spread through the densely packed tenements of the port district, jumping from house to house, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood with terrifying efficiency. The hospitals overflowed. The streets filled with corpses. The carefully maintained siege discipline collapsed into chaos as soldiers and civilians died at rates matching or exceeding the Mongol casualties that had prompted the biological attack. But here's the crucial detail that most histories miss. The corpses probably didn't transmit much plague. Modern medical analysis suggests that launching dead bodies over walls was more psychological warfare than effective biological warfare. Plague is caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria that live in fleas that live on rats. For a corpse to transmit plague effectively, it needs to still have live fleas. But corpses that have been dead for hours or days, that have been loaded into trebuchets and launched through the air, probably don't have many live fleas. The fleas jump to new hosts, other humans, other rats, or die from lack of blood meals. So if corpses weren't the main transmission vector, how did plague get into Kaffa? The same way plague always spreads. Rats. Thousands of rats infested the Mongol camp, feeding on garbage in grain stores and occasionally on corpses. Rats carrying fleas. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. And rats don't respect siege walls. Rats are among the best mammalian wall climbers on Earth. They squeeze through gaps in stone blocks. They climb using cracks and crevices. They swim across moats. They infiltrate cities under cover of darkness while humans sleep, attracted by smells of food and garbage. The theatrical biological warfare, the corpse catapulting, may have been psychologically devastating but probably wasn't the primary transmission route. The rats were. As they always are. As they always have been throughout plague's bloody history. The distinction matters. It matters because it tells us something important about biological warfare. It's really hard to do effectively. Disease transmission is complicated. Pathogens have specific requirements for survival and spread. You can't just throw infected material at enemies and expect epidemic disease to result. The Mongols at Kaffa tried to weaponize plague and probably failed in their immediate tactical objective. The corpses were theater, psychological warfare designed to terrorize defenders. The actual plague transmission happened through natural vectors, rats and fleas, that the Mongols didn't understand and couldn't control. But the theater worked. The psychological impact was devastating enough that it achieved strategic objectives. The siege ended. The Genoese abandoned Kaffa. And more importantly, 12 Genoese merchant ships fled the city in October 1347, sailing west across the Black Sea toward Mediterranean ports. Those ships were carrying cargo and crew and rats. Infected rats whose fleas carried plague bacteria. Those 12 ships would seed plague outbreaks at every port they touched: Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona. From those ports, plague would spread inland along trade routes, carried by merchants and refugees and soldiers, eventually reaching every corner of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. 200 million people would die over 5 years. 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Comparable proportions in other regions. And it started at Kaffa, at a siege where biological warfare was pioneered, where a Mongol Khan looked at epidemic disease destroying his army and thought, let's share this. Let's make the enemy experience what we're experiencing. Let's weaponize the apocalypse. Here's my question for you, and I want to hear your answer in the comments. Was this evil? Or was this just war? Because the Mongols weren't trying to commit genocide. They were trying to win a siege. They used the tools available to them. They pioneered a tactic that commanders have used ever since. Is biological warfare different from other warfare? Or is killing people with disease morally equivalent to killing people with swords and arrows? Drop a comment. Let's debate this. Because your answer to this question reveals something about how you think about war and morality and what rules, if any, should govern how we kill each other. Let's examine what happened next. Because the corpse catapulting at Kaffa established a precedent that echoes through history. Once commanders knew disease could be weaponized, once they saw that biological attacks could achieve strategic objectives, the idea couldn't be unthought. Biological warfare became part of the toolkit of war. Spanish conquistadors gave smallpox-contaminated blankets to Native American populations in the 16th century. Whether this was deliberate biological warfare or simply callous opportunism is debated by historians. Some sources suggest Spanish commanders understood they were spreading disease. Other sources suggest they were simply disposing of contaminated materials without care for consequences. Either way, millions of indigenous Americans died from smallpox and other European diseases. The population of the Americas declined by approximately 90% in the century following European contact. Most died from disease. Whether that disease was weaponized deliberately or spread through negligence doesn't change the death toll. The precedent was established. Disease kills more effectively than weapons. British forces deliberately gave smallpox-contaminated blankets to Native Americans during the siege of Fort Pitt in 1763. This is documented. Captain Simeon Acquire gave blankets from a smallpox hospital to Native American emissaries during negotiations, explicitly hoping to spread disease. Colonel Henry Bouquet and General Jeffrey Amherst discussed using smallpox as a weapon in correspondence that survives in historical archives. Amherst wrote, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians?" Bouquet replied that he would try using infected blankets. The tactic probably had limited effectiveness. Smallpox transmission through contaminated materials is less efficient than direct person-to-person transmission. But the intent was clear. British military commanders in North America were deliberately attempting to spread epidemic disease to enemy populations. World War I saw both sides accuse the other of biological warfare. The Germans were accused of infecting horses and cattle with glanders and anthrax to disrupt Allied supply chains. The Allies were accused of spreading influenza deliberately. Most accusations were probably propaganda rather than fact. But the suspicions reveal that by the 20th century, biological warfare was considered plausible, something armies might do. The taboo established at Kaffa had weakened. The moral line against weaponizing disease had blurred. World War II saw extensive biological weapons research by multiple powers. Japan's Unit 731 conducted horrific experiments on Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, testing plague, anthrax, cholera, and other diseases. They dropped plague-infected fleas from aircraft over Chinese cities, killing thousands. They contaminated water supplies with cholera and typhoid bacteria. They injected prisoners with various pathogens and vivisected them without anesthesia to observe disease progression. The experiments were scientifically useless. The data was too poorly collected and too compromised by the torture context to yield meaningful medical insights. But they killed thousands and demonstrated that modern states were willing to use disease as a weapon despite international laws prohibiting it. The United States granted Unit 731 researchers immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for their data. The Soviet Union captured Unit 731 personnel and used their knowledge to develop their own biological weapons programs. The United States developed extensive biological weapons programs during the Cold War, weaponizing anthrax, plague, tularemia, brucellosis, and other pathogens. They developed bombs and missiles capable of dispersing biological agents over large areas. They stockpiled enough weaponized anthrax to kill the global population several times over. The Soviet Union developed even more extensive programs. Their bioprepared organization employed thousands of scientists working to weaponize diseases. They engineered antibiotic-resistant strains of plague. They attempted to weaponize smallpox despite the global eradication campaign. They experimented with Marburg virus and other hemorrhagic fevers. They worked on genetic engineering to create entirely new pathogens combining traits from multiple diseases. Their programs continued until at least the 1990s, possibly later, despite international treaties banning biological weapons. The 1972 Biological Weapons Convention banned the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. 183 countries have signed. But verification is nearly impossible. Biological weapons facilities look identical to pharmaceutical factories and medical research laboratories. Pathogens necessary for weapons research are the same pathogens used for vaccine development and disease surveillance. Dual-use research, research that could be used for either beneficial or harmful purposes, is unavoidable in modern biology. The technology to engineer pathogens is increasingly accessible. CRISPR gene editing tools allow relatively unskilled researchers to modify bacterial and viral genomes. The knowledge to create biological weapons is available in scientific literature and cannot be erased. The precedent established at CAFA, that disease can be weaponized, cannot be reversed. And here's the terrifying part. Modern biological weapons would make Mongol corpse catapults look like children playing with toys. Modern biotechnology allows engineering of pathogens with properties specifically designed for warfare. Increased lethality. Increased transmission efficiency. Resistance to antibiotics. Ability to evade immune systems. Delayed symptom onset, allowing infected individuals to spread disease before realizing they're sick. Environmental stability, allowing pathogens to persist in buildings or terrain. The possibilities are almost limitless. And the knowledge required is becoming more accessible every year as biology becomes easier and cheaper. Consider COVID-19 for context. Not as biological weapon, the evidence strongly suggests natural origin, but as demonstration of what pandemic disease can do to modern civilization. COVID-19 had a relatively low case fatality rate, approximately 1% overall, lower in young healthy individuals, higher in elderly or immunocompromised individuals. And it still killed millions, crashed economies, overwhelmed healthcare systems, disrupted supply chains, and dominated global politics for years. Imagine a pathogen engineered for lethality instead of natural evolution. Imagine something with the transmissibility of measles, one of the most contagious viruses known, and the lethality of Ebola, with case fatality rates exceeding 50%. Imagine that disease spreading globally before public health authorities even realize it exists because symptoms are delayed for weeks. Imagine it resistant to all antibiotics or antivirals. Imagine it stable enough to persist in environments for days or weeks. That's not science fiction. That's feasible with current technology. Not easy. Biological weapons are hard to develop and harder to deploy effectively, but feasible for state-level programs with appropriate resources. and getting more feasible every year as biotechnology advances and knowledge spreads. The line from CAFA to modern biological weapons is direct. Janabeg showed that disease could be weaponized. Every subsequent biological weapons program has built on that precedent, trying to perfect what the Mongols started: the deliberate spread of epidemic disease as a tool of warfare. The methods have changed. The technology has advanced beyond anything medieval commanders could imagine. But the core concept remains identical. Use disease to kill enemies. Weaponize biology itself. And we haven't solved the fundamental problem. The problem that limited biological warfare effectiveness at CAFA still limits it today. Disease spreads. You can't control it once released. You can't guarantee it only affects enemies and not your own people. You can develop vaccines for your own populations, but vaccines aren't perfect. You can engineer pathogens with specific genetic targets, but pathogens mutate. You can try to contain outbreak after deployment, but containment often fails. Every biological weapons program in history has experienced accidents, releases, infections of unintended targets. The Soviet Union's Aralsk incident in 1971 killed 3 people from weaponized smallpox that escaped a testing facility. The U.S. Army's experiments at Dugway Proving Ground killed thousands of sheep when nerve agent drifted off target. Not biological warfare, but demonstration of how difficult targeted weapons deployment actually is. Biological weapons are inherently unstable, inherently dangerous to everyone including the user. That's why they've been used relatively rarely despite nearly 7 centuries passing since CAFA. Not because of morality. States have shown repeatedly they'll use any weapon they think gives advantage. But because biological weapons are so risky to the user that conventional weapons are usually safer and more effective. Why weaponize plague when you can drop bombs? Why risk uncontrollable pandemic when you can use precision missiles? Biological weapons remain niche weapons, terror weapons, weapons of last resort or desperation. But they remain possible. The precedent exists. The knowledge exists. The technology is advancing. And the temptation remains for actors who see biological weapons as equalizers, ways for weaker powers to threaten stronger powers asymmetrically. A state or non-state actor without advanced conventional military capabilities might see biological weapons as the great equalizer. Pandemic disease doesn't care about military spending or technological superiority. It kills presidents and peasants, generals and infantry, developed and developing nations. A biological weapon that spreads globally could theoretically level the playing field between unequal powers. That's the nightmare scenario. Not state programs developing biological weapons. Those can be monitored, deterred, contained through international pressure and consequences. The nightmare is non-state actors, terrorist organizations or apocalyptic cults or even individuals, obtaining the knowledge and resources to engineer and deploy pandemic disease. The barriers are higher than often portrayed in fiction. Creating effective biological weapons requires expertise, equipment, and resources beyond what most non-state actors possess. But the barriers are lowering. The technology is advancing. The knowledge is spreading. The probability of non-state biological warfare is low but non-zero. And the consequences of even one successful attack could be catastrophic. One more call to action before we finish. If you're still here, comment 1346. So I know you're paying attention. And tell me, what topic should I cover next? What dark corner of history needs exposure? Drop your suggestions. The most disturbing suggestions get priority because that's what this channel does. We explore the parts of history that make people uncomfortable. We look at the atrocities, the catastrophes, the moments when humanity showed its worst face. Comment your suggestions. Let's map the darkest timeline together. Let's bring this home. Let's connect CAFA to today. Because the corpses that flew over those walls in October 1346 started something that hasn't ended. They pioneered a form of warfare that continues to threaten humanity. They established a precedent that states and non-state actors reference when considering biological weapons. They demonstrated that disease can achieve strategic objectives that conventional weapons cannot. And they killed 200 million people through the pandemic they helped spread. Marco, that 19-year-old Genoese soldier on the wall, survived the initial bombardment. He survived watching corpses rain down on his city. He even survived the plague epidemic inside Kaffa. But he didn't survive what came next. He boarded one of those 12 ships that fled Kaffa in October 1347. He sailed to Messina with plague-infected rats in the hold. He developed fever during the voyage. He died before the ship reached port, his body thrown overboard, feeding fishes in the Mediterranean while his ship carried plague to Sicily and seeded the outbreak that would consume Europe. Marco's story is everyone's story during the Black Death. Individual choices, small decisions, understandable actions. Fleeing a plague city, sailing home, seeking safety. Each decision rational from individual perspective. Each decision contributing to catastrophe at civilizational scale. The 12 ships that fled Kaffa weren't carrying villains. They were carrying survivors trying to escape death. But they were also carrying rats. And the rats were carrying fleas. And the fleas were carrying Yersinia pestis. And that bacterium killed 200 million people because 12 ships made rational individual choices that led to collective catastrophe. That pattern repeats throughout history. Kaffa wasn't unique in that regard. It was just first documented use of biological warfare. First time commanders deliberately tried to spread epidemic disease. First time someone looked at pandemic and thought, let's share this. Let's weaponize the apocalypse itself. The tactic probably didn't work as intended. The corpses were theater, the rats did the actual disease transmission. But the precedent was established. The idea was implanted. Biological warfare became thinkable, possible, real. 7 centuries later, we're still dealing with consequences. We're still threatened by biological weapons. We're still vulnerable to pandemic disease, whether natural or engineered. We're still making individual rational choices that create collective catastrophic risks. We're still throwing corpses over walls, metaphorically if not literally. We're still weaponizing biology. We're still dying from decisions made by commanders who thought they were just trying to win. The siege of Kaffa ended in November 1346. Janibeg withdrew his plague-devastated army. The Genoese abandoned the city. The walls still stood, but the city was dead or dying. And plague was loose in the world, spreading along trade routes, killing millions, transforming civilizations. The first biological warfare attack in history had succeeded beyond any possible expectation. Not tactically, the siege failed in its immediate objectives. But strategically, plague reached Europe, killed 1/3 of the population, destabilized kingdoms, ended feudalism, triggered religious upheavals, inspired the Renaissance through the social transformations that followed mass death. The corpses that flew over Kaffa's walls in October 1346 changed history more than any battle, any war, any conventional military campaign. And they're still flying. Different forms, different methods, different centuries. But always the same core concept. Use disease to kill enemies. Weaponize biology. Spread death deliberately and systematically. Make enemies experience the horror you're experiencing. Share the dying. The tactic that started at Kaffa continues today in laboratories where researchers design pathogens, in planning sessions where military officers consider biological weapons as options, in the nightmares of public health officials who imagine pandemic disease deliberately released. We can't uninvent biological warfare. We can't erase the knowledge. We can't undo the precedent. The corpses will keep flying, literally or metaphorically, until humanity either destroys itself or learns to control its worst impulses. And based on 7 centuries of history since Kaffa, betting on humanity learning seems optimistic. Comment below. Share this. Make sure this story reaches people who need to hear it. Because the lesson of Kaffa is clear. Individual rational choices create collective catastrophes. Commanders thinking tactically create strategic disasters. Biological weapons meant to win sieges kill millions across continents. The corpses fly today just as they flew in 1346. We're all inside Kaffa now, watching the sky, wondering when the next plague will arc over the wall and crash into our streets. The siege never ended. The biological warfare never stopped. The dying never ceased. We just got better at hiding from it until we can't hide anymore. Until the pandemic starts. Until millions die. Until we remember that the corpses are still flying. Always have been.
Always will be.
The first biological warfare attack in history started something that will never end. Not until the last human dies. Not until the last pathogen goes extinct. Not until biological weapons become impossible. Which means never. The corpses keep flying. Forever.